Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to cut through the complexity of the latest research, distill the critical knowledge, and, well, give you the surprising insights you need to be instantly well informed. Today, we are diving into a really complex area where global trade policy sort of clashes with resource conservation, fisheries subsidies. Our deep dive is built around a pretty powerful 2019 review article. It's titled Fisheries Subsidies, the Interaction Between Science and Policy. Lead authors Yutaro Sakai, Nobuyuki Yagi, and Usif Rashid Sumaila.
Yeah, in this paper, it isn't just a summary of what we know. It really digs into whether all this academic research, the theory, the stats, is actually making its way to the policy tables, like at the WTO. It's really looking at how well that science-policy connection is working, especially on the link between subsidies and, the huge problem of overfishing.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Before we dive deep into the science itself, why did this whole issue suddenly become such a big deal? Moving from just an environmental worry to something the WTO had to tackle globally.
Well, it really started gaining serious international attention back in the 90s. The FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, they flagged it way back in 92. They basically said government money was helping drive fish stocks down. And then the 2002 World Summit on Sustainable Development really hammered it home. Subsidies were fueling unsustainable fishing all over the world.
But hang on, the WTO usually deals with fair trade, right? Like tariffs, dumping. They don't typically get into environmental management, do they?
Exactly. And that was the big policy gap the paper points out. Before the early 2000s, the WTO rules things like GATT and the SCM agreement, which covers government handouts. They only cared if a subsidy messed with trade. Whether it harmed the actual fish, well, that was outside their scope.
I see. So harmful subsidies could just keep going unchecked.
Pretty much. The WTO did start trying to tighten things up around 2001. And then the Hong Kong Ministerial Declaration in 2005, that was meant to ban subsidies leading to overcapacity and overfishing. But the negotiations just stalled again and again for like decades. And that political deadlock is exactly why getting solid scientific agreement on the actual effects of these subsidies became so critical. It was needed to push things forward.
So the research community really had this mission, as the paper frames it, to basically give the diplomats the hard evidence they needed. How did they structure that evidence?
The paper lays it out quite neatly, actually, into three main pillars that build the whole case. First is descriptive. That's the groundwork, defining the problem, putting a number on it. Then you have theoretical. That uses economic models to predict why subsidies cause harm. And finally, empirical, using real-world data to see if those predictions hold up.
Okay, let's start with the descriptive stuff, the scale. What was that first big number that made policymakers sit up and take notice?
Oh, that initial FAO estimate in 92 is a real shocker. They looked at global fishing revenue, maybe $70 billion, and compared it to the total costs, a staggering $124 billion. The gap, $54 billion, was assumed to be government subsidies.
Wait, $54 billion? So governments were covering a massive global loss every year. It sounds like fishing wasn't even a viable industry back then.
That's the sort of economic absurdity this research brought to light, yeah. It was like a huge taxpayer-funded operation depleting fish stocks. Later studies, like Malazzo's big one in 98, refined things. They focused just on the harmful capacity-boosting subsidies, putting them around $14 to $20.5 billion. And the latest numbers we tend to use now, around $35 billion globally in 2009 dollars.
Okay.
And this is also where those categories came from, the good, bad, and ugly subsidies. Good ones support management research. Bad ones boost capacity. Think fuel subsidies, boat building grants. And the ugly ones, like vessel buybacks. Well, they're complicated, often backfire. We can get into that.
Yeah, definitely. But first, here's a really striking detail for you listening, something from those descriptive studies about just how reliant some fleets are on those bad subsidies.
You mean the high seas bottom trawlers?
Exactly.
Yeah, that example is critical. It shows real dependency. These fleets, which do a lot of damage, get about $125 million a year. And that's 25% of their total landing value. When you think typical profit margins are maybe 10% at best.
It means most of them wouldn't survive without the cash.
Precisely. That 25% subsidy strongly suggests a huge chunk of that fleet is only economically viable because of government funding. Taxpayers are literally paying them to potentially degrade the resource.
Wow. Okay, so what's fascinating here is how the theoretical models then take that dependency and explain the actual mechanism of harm. They give us the why, right?
Exactly. And it often boils down to pretty simple economics, using models like the Gordon-Schaefer framework. Think about an open access fishery. People fish until costs equal revenue, so zero profit. Now, if the government throws in a subsidy that cuts costs, like cheap fuel, well, the total cost curve shifts down.
Creates artificial profit.
Right, which attracts more boats, more fishing effort, and ultimately pushes the fish stock down to a lower, more depleted level. Price supports, which push the revenue curve up, do basically the same thing. More effort, fewer fish.
But what about the counter-argument? Someone listening might think, well, what if the fishery is actually well managed, say with strict quotas or single ownership? Shouldn't that stop overfishing, even with subsidies?
That's a really important point, and the theoretical research absolutely dives into that nuance. Yes, if you had a theoretical perfect sole owner focused only on long-term value, they might still fish more if their costs dropped. But the key point is, if you have a strong manager who sets a fixed, scientifically sound quota, a hard cap on the harvest, then subsidies should really only affect profits and maybe how efficiently they fish, not the total amount of fish caught.
Okay, so the management could override the economic incentive?
It could. But then the theory brings in the political dimension. This raises an important question. Studies like Pools from 2000 show that when you have more effort driven by subsidies, maybe even things like unemployment schemes tied to fishing time, it builds political pressure. Suddenly you have lots of people whose jobs depend on that subsidized fishing. They become a powerful lobby.
And they pressure managers to weaken the rules.
Exactly. To raise the quotas, extend the season. So the subsidies might not break the resource directly through pure economics in that scenario, but they can break the political will needed to manage it sustainably.
That really changes the game. It's not just economics, it's politics too. Okay, speaking of things breaking, let's talk vessel buyback programs, VBPs, often pitched as green subsidies, right? To shrink the fleet. But the theory suggests maybe not so green.
Yeah, the theory points out some major flaws. 3 big ones. First, they're often just not very effective. They tend to buy out the oldest, least efficient boats, so the actual cut in fishing power is pretty small.
Okay, minimal impact.
What else? Second, there's the seeping back in problem. Unless you immediately lock in strict, permanent limits on fishing effort, what happens? The boats left behind, the more efficient ones, just fish harder. Or new boats enter the fishery. The capacity reduction just evaporates.
Right, it gets canceled out. And the third flaw is the really tricky one, the one about expectations. I think this is a key insight for our listener.
Absolutely. This is the time inconsistency problem, which Clark and others highlighted. It's quite counterintuitive. If fishers start expecting the government to offer buybacks in the future, maybe paying a good price for their old boats.
They have an incentive to invest more now.
Exactly. They might overinvest in bigger, better vessels today, viewing that potential future buyback as a kind of subsidy on their investment. So the policy, meant to solve overcapacity, might actually encourage it in the first place.
Wow, that's a perverse outcome. Okay, let's shift to the third pillar then, the empirical evidence. You said robust studies are maybe a bit scarce, but there have been advances recently. Do they back up the theory?
Generally, yes. The empirical work, especially in the last decade or so, often confirms what the models predict. And a lot of the key findings are about the type of subsidy. For instance, Sumaila and his colleagues found empirically that those bad subsidies are significantly linked to potential catch losses, particularly hitting vulnerable places like small island developing states hard. But the good subsidies, for management and research, they didn't find a statistical link to catch loss there.
So the type really matters.
It seems to. And another interesting empirical study by Duty and Fletton in Vietnam looked at fuel subsidies, a classic bad one. They found it did boost profits in the short term, but that boost faded really quickly. Why? Because the extra fishing effort it encouraged was so intense it actually degraded the resource base fast. The fish just couldn't keep up.
So the short-term gain led to longer-term pain for the resource. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, connecting back to that science policy question. Was the science actually getting through? You mentioned Sakai's 2017 work.
Yes, Sakai's study was a big deal. Really novel because it was the first empirical work to directly examine how subsidies impact the actual resource stocks themselves, not just fishing inputs or outfeed.
And what did it find?
It confirmed that, yes, direct payments and cost-reducing subsidies were harmful to fish stock health. That was the bad news. But, and this is the crucial part for policy, it found an interaction effect. Those negative impacts on the fish stocks, they basically disappeared, they were not detected, in countries that used strong management systems. Specifically, individual transferable quotas, or ITQs.
Ah, so the management system is the key variable.
Exactly. It strongly suggests the subsidy itself isn't inherently destructive if you have robust, effective resource management in place. It tells policymakers, look, the problem isn't just the money, it's the money combined with weak management. It helps target the intervention.
That's a powerful message for the WTO negotiators. Now, zooming out again, the review also mentions studies using general equilibrium models, looking at the whole economy, not just fishing. What's the takeaway there?
Right, the bigger picture. Those studies, like from Carvalho or Garcia-Cutrian, they suggest something important. Removing subsidies. Yes, it probably causes some short-term pain in the fishing sector itself, job losses, maybe lower output initially, but when you account for the long-term recovery of the fish stocks, the overall benefit, the welfare gain for the entire economy, is actually much larger.
How so?
Well, taxpayers save money, for one, and the healthier recovered resource can then support a more sustainable, potentially more valuable fishery in the long run. It creates broader economic value.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, let's talk limitations. What are the big challenges the paper flags for researchers still trying to pin down this subsidy depletion link?
Data quality is still the big one. It's better now, definitely. The OECD's FSC database, started in 2009, is more detailed and crucially includes China, which gives out the most subsidies globally. But the problem is, it's all self-reported data from countries.
Which raises questions about accuracy.
Exactly. Are countries maybe underreporting certain types of subsidies?
Yeah.
It's a real concern. So researchers need to be smart, use sophisticated techniques like country fixed effects in their models, to try and account for that potential bias.
So, looking ahead from a policy angle, where should science focus next to be the most helpful?
The paper really pushes for more analysis at the fishery level. Right now, a lot of studies are either really broad, looking at whole countries, or super specific, looking at individual boats. But policy decisions, management decisions, they happen at the fishery level, like a specific cod fishery or a tuna fishery. We need more studies showing how different subsidies play out in those specific contexts.
That makes sense. Get more granular, but at the relevant management scale.
Yeah. And the other big plea, really, is for more interaction, more dialogue between the scientists, the economists, and the actual policymakers, the diplomats at the WTO. Most negotiators aren't fishery experts, right? They're diplomats. They might just not be aware of all the scientific progress that's been made here. And without that understanding, designing effective policy is incredibly difficult. It leads to the kind of stalling we've seen.
So, bridging that gap is crucial. Okay, let's try and synthesize. So, what does this all mean? We've got bad subsidies clearly linked to overfishing, but good management, especially quotas, seems to be a powerful antidote. But you mentioned a final twist. A complexity.
Yeah, there's this theoretical possibility that the paper touches on, kind of a cautionary note. What if you remove certain subsidies, maybe ones designed for income support? Could it maybe perversely make some fishers feel they need to fish even more hours, put in more effort, just to make up for that lost income?
Potentially harming stocks even more.
Potentially, yes. It's a complex behavioral response. It just highlights that you can't always assume removing any subsidy is automatically good for conservation in every single case. It really underscores why we need that rigorous, context-specific data and analysis, not just broad-brush solutions. Balancing the economics and the ecology is tricky.
Absolutely. A fascinating, complex picture.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the critical interaction between fishery science and global policy.